The year is 1944, the Philippine Sea. A warship built 3 decades earlier slices through Pacific waters at 30 knots, a speed that once made her a marvel of naval engineering. On her bridge stands an officer who has served aboard her for 7 years, a man who knows every rivet, every gun, every compartment of this steel cathedral. He has been taught since his days at the Imperial Naval Academy that Japanese warships embodied a philosophy, a perfection of martial spirit, fused with engineering excellence, speed, firepower, aggressive tactics. These were not just capabilities. They were expressions of national character, proof that Bushido and modern warfare could merge into something unstoppable. In 48 minutes, American shells will begin finding their mark, and he will discover that philosophy cannot stop high-explosive rounds, that spirit cannot deflect radar-directed fire, and that the ship he has loved like a living thing was designed for a war that no longer exists. This is the story of the Kongo-Class battleships, 4 vessels that served Japan for 3 decades, surviving more battles than almost any other capital ships of World War II. But it is really about the moment an entire naval doctrine collided with a revolution in warfare it never anticipated, and what it reveals about the gap between tradition and adaptation, between the navy you built and the war you are actually fighting, between what you believe your weapons can do and what the enemy's weapons are designed to destroy. November 1913, Barrow-in-Furness, England, the shipyard of Vickers Limited, where British craftsmen are completing a warship for the Imperial Japanese Navy. She is called Kongo, and she represents something unprecedented in Japanese naval history. For the first time, Japan has commissioned a capital ship built entirely to their specifications, but constructed with British expertise, British metallurgy, British knowledge accumulated over centuries of naval supremacy. The man overseeing her final construction is a Japanese naval officer who will later become an admiral, watching every detail, learning every technique, preparing to take this knowledge home. The Kongo is not just a ship. She is a vessel carrying British naval doctrine across the Pacific, a tangible expression of Japan's determination to join the elite club of naval powers through a combination of foreign expertise and domestic ambition. She displaces over 27,000 tons. She carries 8 14-inch guns in 4 turrets. Her steam turbines can push her to 27 knots, making her one of the fastest capital ships afloat. By the standards of 1913, she is magnificent. By the standards of 1944, she is a relic powered by dreams. To understand what happened to the Kongo-Class, you first need to understand what Japanese naval officers believed about battlecruisers, about speed, about offensive warfare. They believed that decisive battle was inevitable, that when the Japanese and American fleets finally met, victory would go to whoever could concentrate firepower most rapidly at the critical point. They believed speed was a weapon as important as guns, that the ability to choose engagement range and timing could compensate for numerical inferiority. They believed in the superiority of the offensive, in aggressive action, in accepting risk to achieve decisive results. This was not merely tactical doctrine. It was philosophical conviction, rooted in centuries of samurai tradition, adapted to modern steel and steam. The Kongo-Class embodied this philosophy. Fast battleships, later reclassified as battlecruisers, then back to fast battleships again as modifications added armor. Ships designed to strike hard and fast, to hunt enemy cruisers, to support the battle line with superior speed. When 3 more sisters followed, Hiei, Haruna, and Kirishima, all built in Japanese yards using knowledge transferred from Britain, they formed the core of a fleet designed for aggressive, decisive action. For 2 decades, this seemed brilliant. For the next 2 decades, it would prove catastrophically inadequate. Pearl Harbor changes everything, but not in the way Japanese planners anticipated. They have achieved tactical surprise, damaged the American battle line, and seemingly validated their doctrine of aggressive preemptive action. The Kongo-Class, now nearly 30 years old but extensively modernized, begins a war that will test every assumption built into their original design. Early victories reinforce confidence. The ships are fast, powerful, adaptable. They escort carrier task forces, bombard enemy positions, engage in surface actions. Hiei and Kirishima participate in the brutal night battles off Guadalcanal in November 1942, actions that showcase both their strengths and the beginning of their obsolescence. Hiei engages American cruisers and destroyers at point-blank range in darkness, her 14-inch guns thundering at targets so close her crew can see the enemy's muzzle flashes. She survives the night action, but is crippled, left dead in the water as dawn breaks. American aircraft arrive with the morning light. What follows is not battle, but execution. Wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes attack a ship that can barely maneuver, that lacks the radar fire control to track multiple high-speed targets, that was never designed to defend herself against massed air attack. She absorbs dozens of hits. Her crew fights with desperate courage, but courage cannot compensate for fundamental design limitations. By afternoon, Hiei is abandoned and scuttled, the first Kongo-class battleship lost to a threat that did not exist when her keel was laid in 1911. 2 nights later, Kirishima faces her moment of reckoning, the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. She has escorted Japanese transports toward the island, her mission to bombard Henderson Field and suppress American air power. Instead, she encounters the battleship USS Washington and the USS South Dakota in darkness. What happens next crystallizes everything wrong with Japanese confidence in traditional surface engagement doctrine. Kirishima opens fire on South Dakota, hitting her multiple times, seemingly validating the aggressive close-range tactics Japanese officers have practiced for decades. Her crew experiences the intoxication of successful gunnery, the satisfaction of seeing shells strike home. They do not see Washington maneuvering into firing position, her radar tracking Kirishima with a precision impossible in darkness before electronic fire control. When Washington opens fire at 8,400 yards, she is not guessing. Her Mark III fire control radar has already calculated range, bearing, and target motion. Her 16-inch guns fire with methodical accuracy, and Kirishima is hit by at least 9 shells in 7 minutes. 9 shells, 7 minutes. The difference between radar-directed fire and optical gunnery in darkness. Kirishima's forward turrets are destroyed. Her superstructure is shattered. Fires rage throughout the ship. She has been rendered combat ineffective before her crew fully understood what was attacking them. By midnight, she is sinking, and 212 men go down with her. The lesson is clear but will not be learned in time. Speed and courage are not enough when the enemy can see in the dark and you cannot. The surviving Kongo-class ships, Kongo and Haruna, continue operating, but the war has fundamentally changed. The decisive surface battle Japanese doctrine anticipated has not materialized. Instead, the war is being fought by carriers and submarines, by aircraft and torpedoes, by weapons that render battleship gun duels increasingly irrelevant. The Kongo-class ships have been modified repeatedly, bristling with additional anti-aircraft guns, their superstructures cluttered with fire directors and rangefinders. But these are adaptations to a threat they were never designed to counter. Adding more guns to a 1913-era hull does not transform it into an effective anti-aircraft platform. The fundamental problem is architectural. These ships were designed when aircraft were fragile biplanes, when the primary threat to a capital ship was another capital ship's guns or a torpedo from a slow-moving surface vessel. Now they face dive bombers that attack at 300 miles per hour from multiple angles simultaneously, torpedo planes with coordination and tactics refined through years of combat, submarines that can track task forces submerged and attack with torpedoes guided by sophisticated fire control. The Kongo-Class possessed neither the radar coverage, nor the fire control systems, nor the gun arrangements to defend effectively against massed modern air attack. Their speed, once their greatest advantage, now serves primarily to keep them operating with carrier task forces that themselves are desperately trying to survive against American naval aviation, growing stronger with every month. This is the part of the story where we need to slow down and understand something about institutional psychology and technological change. When you have built your entire naval doctrine around certain assumptions, when those assumptions have been validated by early success, when your national identity is bound up in martial traditions emphasizing spirit over material, evidence contradicting those assumptions does not feel like useful information. It feels like defeatism. Japanese naval leadership in 1943 and 1944 faced mounting evidence that their pre-war doctrine was obsolete, that American advantages in radar, fire control, damage control, and industrial production were decisive. Individual officers understood this. Combat reports made it clear ships were being lost to threats they could not effectively counter. But institutional change requires more than evidence. It requires the willingness to admit that your fundamental approach is wrong, that the ships you built and the tactics you practiced and the philosophy you embraced were optimized for a war that was never going to happen. This is psychologically devastating for a naval officer corps that had spent decades preparing for decisive surface action, that had built its entire identity around aggressive offensive operations and the superiority of well-trained crews over material advantage. The Americans had more ships, more aircraft, more resources, but Japanese officers had been taught that these material factors could be overcome by superior tactics and fighting spirit. The Kongo-Class ships became floating test cases for this belief. Could old ships, extensively modernized, crewed by experienced sailors, still compete against newer vessels with technological advantages? Could courage and skill compensate for radar and electronics and superior damage control? The answer was arriving shell by shell, torpedo by torpedo, but accepting that answer meant confronting decades of comfortable assumptions. June 1944, the Philippine Sea. The battle that will destroy Japanese naval aviation unfolds, and the Kongo-Class ships are there, part of a force that includes carriers, cruisers, destroyers, the assembled striking power of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The resulting engagement is so one-sided that American pilots will call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese aircraft are massacred by American fighters, guided to intercepts by radar, by anti-aircraft fire directed by proximity-fused shells that explode near targets without requiring direct hits. The carriers that launch these doomed strikes are themselves hunted by American submarines and aircraft. 3 carriers are sunk. Japanese naval aviation loses over 600 aircraft and most of their experienced pilots. The Kongo and Haruna survive the battle, but survival is becoming their primary mission. They are no longer offensive weapons capable of bringing decisive combat power to critical points. They are expensive liabilities that require escort, that consume fuel, that represent targets for American submarines prowling the waters between Japan's shrinking empire. Their speed, once magnificent, is now used primarily for retreat and evasion. October 1944, Leyte Gulf. The largest naval battle in history, and the Kongo-Class ships participate in what will be their final major surface action. The Japanese plan is complex, involving multiple forces converging on American landing forces in the Philippines. The Kongo and Haruna are part of Admiral Kurita's center force, steaming through the Sibuyan Sea toward the landing beaches. What happens next demonstrates everything that has gone wrong with Japanese naval warfare. The force is spotted by American submarines, then attacked by carrier aircraft, wave after wave. The super battleship Musashi, pride of the Japanese fleet, largest battleship ever built, is hit by an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs over the course of hours. She capsizes and sinks, taking over 1,000 men with her. This is what American naval aviation can do now. This is the firepower the Kongo-Class must survive to reach their objective. They are hit repeatedly but remain operational, their speed allowing them to maneuver, their anti-aircraft batteries throwing up desperate defensive fire. They survive the day, but the force is shattered, disorganized, and Kurita makes the controversial decision to temporarily withdraw. By the time he reverses course and approaches the landing area, the opportunity has passed. The Kongo and Haruna participate in the battle off Samar, engaging American escort carriers and destroyers in the kind of surface action Japanese doctrine had always anticipated. But even here, against light forces, the battle does not unfold as pre-war planning envisioned. The American ships fight with desperate ferocity. Their destroyers make torpedo runs that force Japanese battleships to maneuver. Their aircraft attack continuously. The escort carriers retreat behind smokescreens and rain squalls. And critically, Kurita loses his nerve, breaking off the action when complete victory seems within reach. The Kongo-class ships survive Leyte Gulf, but the battle marks the end of the Japanese surface fleet as an effective force. They have fought their decisive battle. They have lost. November 21, 1944, the Taiwan Strait. Kongo is steaming in company with the cruiser Yahagi and several destroyers, moving between Brunei and Japan. The end, when it comes, arrives from beneath the waves. The American submarine USS Sea Lion has been tracking the force, maneuvering into attack position, waiting for the optimal firing solution. The submarine's captain, Eli Reich, understands that he has an opportunity to sink a capital ship, something every submarine commander dreams of. At 02:56 hours, Sea Lion fires a spread of 6 torpedoes from her bow tubes. The Kongo's lookouts spot the torpedo wakes too late. 3 torpedoes strike her starboard side. The explosions are catastrophic. 1 torpedo hits near the forward magazine. Another strikes amidships. The third hits aft near the steering gear. For a ship built in 1913, even one extensively modernized, this is fatal damage. Flooding is immediate and uncontrollable. The Kongo begins listing to starboard. Her crew fights to save her. Damage control parties struggling against inrushing water, but the ship's compartmentalization was designed to counter shell damage and surface torpedo hits, not modern submarine torpedoes striking below the armor belt. Within 2 hours, the list becomes critical. The order to abandon ship is given. At 05:24 hours, Kongo capsizes and sinks, taking down 1,250 officers and men. She has survived 3 years of war, participated in more major actions than almost any Allied battleship, traveled thousands of miles, fired her guns in anger dozens of times. In the end, she is destroyed by a weapon that cost a fraction of her construction budget, operated by a crew of 80 men in an attack lasting less than a minute. Haruna survives until July 1945, but survival by this point means hiding in Japanese waters, unable to operate effectively due to fuel shortages, air supremacy lost, the naval war already decided. She is attacked repeatedly by American carrier aircraft at her anchorage in Kure. On July 28th, aircraft from Task Force 38 hit her with bombs and rockets. She settles to the bottom in shallow water, her back broken, her era ended. After the war, she is scrapped where she sank. The last of the Kongo-class disappears into razor blades and construction steel, her legacy more complex than simple victory or defeat. Think about what the Kongo-class represents. 4 ships built over a span of years, embodying the naval doctrine and technological understanding of their era. They were good ships, well designed for their original purpose, extensively modernized, served by brave crews. They fought in more actions than most battleships of any nation. They survived longer than larger, newer vessels. And yet they were ultimately inadequate for the war they actually fought. This was not because of design flaws or construction defects. It was because they were fundamentally ships of 1913 trying to survive in 1944, platforms optimized for gunnery duels against other surface ships operating in a war dominated by aircraft carriers, submarines, radar, and electronics. Every modification, every additional anti-aircraft gun, every upgraded fire control system was an attempt to adapt a hull designed for different threats. Some adaptations worked, many did not. You cannot bolt modern capabilities onto old architecture and expect the result to match purpose-built modern vessels. The officers who served aboard the Kongo-Class understood this, at least by the war's end. They watched as radar-equipped American ships tracked them in darkness. They experienced the helplessness of being attacked by massed aircraft their guns could not stop. They saw newer Japanese battleships, ships like Yamato and Musashi, also prove inadequate despite being among the most powerful warships ever built. The problem was not the specific ships. The problem was that battleships themselves, the entire concept of heavily armored gun platforms designed for surface combat, had been rendered obsolescent by the aircraft carrier and the submarine. Speed could not save you from aerial torpedoes. Armor could not protect you from dive bombers attacking your deck. Guns, no matter how large, were useless against enemies beyond the horizon. Japanese naval doctrine had been built around the expectation of a decisive surface battle, a Pacific version of Tsushima, where superior tactics and crew quality could overcome material disadvantage. That battle never happened. Instead, the war was decided by carriers striking carriers, by submarines strangling logistics, by air power that made surface vessels into targets rather than threats. The psychological weight of this realization cannot be understated. Imagine being a Japanese naval officer in 1944, having spent your entire career preparing for surface combat, having trained in gunnery and tactics and ship handling, having studied Tsushima and Jutland, and every major fleet action in history. Now imagine watching as everything you trained for becomes irrelevant, as the ships you served on prove unable to accomplish their designed missions, as American technological advantages in radar and electronics and damage control prove more decisive than Japanese tactical skill or crew dedication. This is not just military defeat. This is the collapse of a professional identity, the revelation that your expertise is obsolete, that the Navy you built was designed for the wrong war. Some officers adapted, learned the lessons, tried to change doctrine and tactics. Others could not, clinging to traditional approaches even as evidence mounted that those approaches no longer worked. This tension between adaptation and tradition played out across the Japanese military, but was especially acute in the Navy, where technological change was most rapid and most decisive. When Kongo sank in the Taiwan Strait, she took with her not just 1,250 men, but also the accumulated experience of 31 years of naval service, officers who had served aboard her since the 1930s, sailors who knew every system, every quirk, every characteristic. That knowledge disappeared in 2 hours, and with it went something less tangible but equally important. The belief that these ships, these beloved vessels that had served so long, could still fight effectively. The surviving crew members were rescued by escorting destroyers, and they carried with them the knowledge that the ship they had trusted, the platform they had believed in, could be destroyed by a single submarine attack despite all their skill and courage and preparation. This is the hidden cost of obsolescence. Not just the loss of material, but the loss of confidence, the realization that what you have is not enough, that what you know how to do is no longer sufficient. The story of the Kongo-Class is often told as a tale of noble ships serving valiantly in a lost cause. This is true, but incomplete. It is also a story about institutional failure to adapt, about the gap between doctrine and reality, about what happens when you build a navy for one kind of war and find yourself fighting another. Japanese naval leadership knew by 1943 that their pre-war assumptions were wrong. Combat experience had taught painful lessons. The question was not whether change was needed, but whether change was possible, given industrial limitations, resource constraints, and the psychological difficulty of admitting that decades of preparation had been misguided. In many ways, the Kongo-Class became symbols of this dilemma. Should limited resources be invested in modifying old ships or building new ones? Should doctrine emphasize what your existing forces could do or what the war actually required? Should you fight the war you are prepared for or adapt to the war you are actually in? Japan chose adaptation, but too slowly and with insufficient resources. The Kongo-Class received modifications, but the modifications were always compromises, always inadequate, always trying to make old platforms relevant in new contexts. Consider the contrast with American naval development. The United States also entered the war with old battleships, many of them survivors of Pearl Harbor. But American doctrine evolved rapidly. Old battleships were used for shore bombardment, for escorting carriers, for missions that leveraged their strengths while acknowledging their vulnerabilities. New construction focused on carriers and submarines and amphibious vessels. American shipyards produced hundreds of escort carriers, thousands of landing craft, submarines in numbers that allowed them to strangle Japanese logistics. This was not because American planners were smarter, but because American industrial capacity allowed experimentation, mistakes, and rapid iteration. Japan had no such luxury. Every ship was precious, every loss irreplaceable. The Kongo-Class had to keep fighting because there was nothing to replace them with, even as it became clear that they were fighting a war they were not designed for. The human dimension of this cannot be ignored. The crews of the Kongo-Class ships were professionals, many of them career sailors who had served aboard these vessels for years. They knew their ship's strengths and limitations better than any analyst or historian. They felt the increasing strain as missions became more desperate, as losses mounted, as fuel grew scarce, and air cover disappeared. They maintained their professionalism even as hope faded, continued fighting even when victory became impossible, stayed at their posts even as their ships were dying beneath them. When Kongo sank in darkness, her crew fought to save her until the end. When Haruna was bombed to wreckage in her anchorage, her crew remained aboard performing damage control, even though there was nowhere to take the ship, nothing she could do, no mission she could accomplish. This kind of dedication deserves recognition, but it also deserves honest assessment. Their courage did not make their ships adequate. Their skill did not compensate for technological disadvantage. Their willingness to die did not change the outcome of battles or the trajectory of the war. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge because we want to believe that human factors matter, that courage and skill and determination can overcome material disadvantage. Sometimes they can. In many cases during World War II, well-trained crews in inferior equipment accomplished extraordinary things. But there are limits. When the technological gap becomes wide enough, when the enemy can see you and you cannot see them, when they can hit you from beyond your weapon's range, when they can mass firepower against which you have no effective defense, courage becomes sacrifice rather than capability. The crews of the Kongo-Class learned this lesson across 3 years of increasingly desperate combat. Each battle was an education in the gap between what their ships could do and what the war required. Each loss, each near miss, each retreat was evidence that the Navy they served was losing a war it had expected to win. The final year of the war saw the Kongo-Class reduced to nearly complete ineffectiveness. Fuel shortages limited operations. Air attacks made movement suicidal. Submarine-infested waters turned every voyage into a gauntlet. The ships that had once embodied Japanese naval power became floating monuments to obsolescence, expensive to maintain, dangerous to operate, incapable of accomplishing meaningful missions. Haruna's end, bombed to wreckage at anchor, unable even to defend herself effectively, crystallizes this trajectory. She did not die fighting. She died helpless, overtaken by a form of warfare her designers never anticipated, and her crew could not counter. After the war, when analysts studied Japanese naval operations, the Kongo-Class became a case study in the problems of fighting with obsolescent platforms. The ships themselves were not at fault. Their crews were not at fault. The fault lay with a system that built a navy for one kind of war and then found itself fighting a completely different conflict, a system that could not adapt quickly enough because adaptation required resources and industrial capacity it did not possess. In a way, the Kongo-Class were victims of decisions made decades before the war began, when their keels were laid, when their mission parameters were defined, when Japanese naval doctrine was formulated around assumptions that seemed reasonable at the time, but proved catastrophically wrong. What does this reveal about naval warfare, about military planning, about the relationship between technology and doctrine? It shows that platforms designed for specific threats can become liabilities when those threats change. It demonstrates that speed and firepower alone are not enough when the enemy can control engagement range and timing through technological advantage. It proves that courage and skill cannot compensate for fundamental design inadequacy. Most importantly, it reveals the danger of building identity and doctrine around specific capabilities rather than specific objectives. Japanese naval doctrine was built around the battleship and the decisive surface engagement because those were the tools and tactics that had worked in 1905 at Tsushima. But war had evolved. The tools changed. The tactics changed. The entire character of naval combat transformed. A navy that could not or would not adapt was doomed regardless of the quality of its ships or the courage of its sailors. The Kongo-Class served for 31 years, from 1913 to 1944, longer than most battleships of any nation. They participated in more actions and survived more battles than vessels theoretically more powerful. They were maintained, modified, and operated by skilled, dedicated crews, and yet, in the end, they could not survive modern naval firepower because they were not designed to. They were products of their time, magnificent when new, adequate when modified, obsolete when tested against purpose-built, modern threats. Their story is not one of failure, but of the inevitable obsolescence that overtakes all military technology, the gap between what was built and what is needed, between preparation and reality. Alone in darkness at the moment, Kongo began her final plunge. The men in the water must have watched their ship disappear and wondered what it had all been for. They had served aboard her for years, some of them. They had maintained her systems, fired her guns, taken pride in her speed and power. Now she was gone, sunk by a submarine they never saw, destroyed in minutes despite decades of service. This is how technological change manifests at the human level, not as abstract concepts or historical trends, but as your ship sinking, your shipmates drowning, your world disappearing into cold water, because the weapon that killed you was designed to exploit vulnerabilities your ship could never overcome. You can believe your ship is powerful. You can train to perfection. You can fight with courage and skill and determination. None of it matters when the enemy has weapons your platform cannot counter and advantages your tactics cannot overcome. This is the lesson of the Kongo-Class. Not that they were bad ships or that their crews were inadequate, but that they were fighting a war for which they were fundamentally unsuited, and no amount of modification or courage could change that reality. In war, as in life, you can believe something deeply and still be wrong. You can prepare thoroughly for the wrong scenario. You can be skilled at things that no longer matter. The Kongo-Class were victims not of their own inadequacy, but of the gap between the war their designers anticipated and the war their crews actually fought. That gap measured in radar coverage and fire control systems and aircraft performance and submarine capabilities, was ultimately unbridgeable. Speed was not enough. Guns were not enough. Courage was not enough. And in the end, 4 ships that had served Japan for 3 decades disappeared, their legacy a warning about the cost of fighting the last war instead of the next one.